Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vaga Muradian. Few people in Washington national security circles are as respected as Michèle Flournoy for her strategic and policy savvy, her measured judgment, bipartisanship, as well as her ability to work well with uniformed, civilian, and political leaders. Flournoy has 3 decades of national security experience, including most recently as policy chief at the Pentagon. Now the CEO of the Center for a New American Security, Flournoy is considered a frontrunner to become the nation's first female defense secretary if Hillary Clinton wins the White House, but has not joined the campaign team. We sat down with Flournoy at CNAS for an exclusive interview on current and future threats, strategy, and managing one of the world's most complex organizations. In part 1 of our 3-part discussion with Flournoy, I asked her about the biggest national security and defense-specific challenges the next administration will have to grapple with. Thank you so much for meeting with us. We really appreciate it. We know how busy you are, and hopefully you're on a rapid mend for the full contact season. Sadly, that's to come. I wanted to start off by asking you that no matter which party wins on November the 8th, what are the sort of biggest national security and defense-specific challenges that the next administration is going to have to grapple with?
I think the next president is going to face probably one of the most volatile and complex international security environments in living memory. I mean, you have immediate challenges of a global terrorism threat from ISIS and others. You have a resurgent Russia that is aggrieved and seeking to flex its muscles and reassert a sphere of influence in Europe. You have a rising China, where open question as to whether it will play by the international rules of the order. You have North Korea. You still have Iran's support for terrorism, even though we've had the nuclear deal. You have new threats in cyberspace. I mean, the list goes on and on. So it's a very complex environment. We're going to have priorities, but there's none of the things on that list, and probably others that should be on the list, can be completely ignored. So it's going to be a really challenging, a pretty daunting inheritance, I'd say.
What do you think are going to be the absolute priorities on that list?
You know, I think that from a U.S. interest point of view, because of the threat to the homeland from ISIS and other transnational terrorist groups, that's going to be on the top of any president's list. But I also think that the sort of muscle flexing that we see from Russia in Europe, its actions in Crimea and Ukraine most recently, but also some of its more sort of unconventional efforts to undermine cohesion and stability in Europe, that's going to have to be on the agenda. How do we reestablish deterrence in Europe? How do we push back on Putin when he crosses lines, and so forth? And then I think, you know, the core of the rebalance, the notion that the region that will ultimately affect U.S. prosperity and security most long-term remains Asia-Pacific. That's going to keep some of our strategic focus, or should keep some of our strategic focus on Asia, and managing that situation with a rising power emerging in China.
I want to talk more about that a little bit later in the interview, but I want to go to the Budget Control Act. It's celebrated its 5th anniversary. I don't think anybody is cheering it on for many more happy returns, but it does have a 5 more years to that plan. It's undermined readiness and presented the department with a whole series of strategic challenges that have led, for example, to the 3rd offset strategy and other things, accepting that we may not have access to those resources. And if you look at the upcoming FYDP, it's $250 billion less between 2018 and 2022 than what President Obama had programmed for those years. And yet both of the presidential candidates have made promises that could potentially be very costly, whether it's, you know, no reform to entitlements or the biggest jobs creation program since we've had since World War II. Does this indicate that potentially defense is going to remain under pressure and make it all the harder to actually break up or somehow negotiate an end to the Budget Control Act?
Yeah, I think the next president has to engage with the leadership in Congress to try to pursue a budget deal that gets us out from under the constant threat of sequestration as a national security issue. I mean, we know it's an economic issue, but it's becoming a national security issue because the combination of the reduction in resources available to defense plus the unpredictability year to year and living from continuing resolution to continuing resolution fundamentally undermines the department's ability to make smart investments in the capabilities that we're going to need to prevail and, you know, to protect U.S. interests in the future. So I think the absence of a predictable budget framework is becoming a national security issue. The risk is accumulating. You know, I think trying to solve all of our deficit and debt problems on the back of discretionary spending is insane. I mean, if you really want to go after this problem, you have to put the bigger pieces of the puzzle on the table, whether it's tax reform, entitlement reform, smart investment in the drivers of U.S. economic competitiveness. Those are the big issues that need to be the subject of some compromise, because we can't solve it on the back of the Department of Defense.
Do you think that, even though that is the case, the Defense Department is the largest discretionary pot of money in the entire government, it is the piggy bank, and so ultimately do you think that the next administration will have to make or ask some very uncomfortable and very tough questions? For example, on the ground-based leg of the triad, for example. You know, when I've asked people, okay, well, where would you go to find some money, for example? They're like, well, look, the undersea leg, you know, you can keep. You know, other people, by the way, say that the gravity fall weapons is where that risk should be taken, and to eliminate that program in terms of the B-61, although I know how important that is to the labs. And, you know, are there questions like that that have to be asked by the next administration to try to get a little bit more headroom?
Sure. I mean, I think with or without a budget deal, you're going to have to ask some hard questions about trade-offs within the existing defense program, but also look at how the Department of Defense does business. And are there ways to, you know, sustain or even improve outcomes while reducing cost? And, you know, one of the areas where I'm most intrigued is healthcare. If you look at the private sector trajectory and trends in healthcare, you see a move from fee-for-service models to value-based healthcare, where you reward and incentivize the best health outcomes, and you incentivize the system to produce those at lower cost. And so you look at Kaiser, Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic. All of these guys have adopted that model and are getting pretty amazing results. Healthcare is a huge percentage of what of the DoD enterprise spends money on. Instead of talking about cutting back benefits for those who serve and their families, which is sort of breaking faith, why not look at, are there ways to deliver health care to DoD members and their families with better outcomes, better customer satisfaction at lower cost? That's what's happening at the cutting edge of civilian health care. Can we bring some of that into the DoD? So I think, you know, there are going to be all kinds of questions, even with a budget deal and with some relief of the pressure. There's still going to be trade-offs, and there's still going to be questions about, can DoD deliver on its various aspects of its mission, you know, at lower cost?
That, though, requires, you know, very careful constituency building.
Sure.
Because almost any time you get next to that, that's like a third rail that many people sadly have been electrocuted on. How would you know, what's maybe a key way to approach that, whether it's through outreach or, you know, much more grassroots level, to sort of, you know, show folks that what it is you're trying to do is actually in their strategic best interest, that their individual best interest, as opposed to seeing something as, well, there goes the department trying to, you know, take something away, for example?
Well, I think in healthcare in particular, the first thing to do is a series of pilot programs that focus on improved outcomes, that you actually get better quality health care for DoD beneficiaries. That's where the focus is. And over time, if you can also demonstrate that in many of those cases you're also going to find that you didn't have to spend money on things that weren't essential to getting that outcome, and you therefore get some cost savings, that's a secondary benefit. But I think you have to start, you know, if you look at, again, DoD customer satisfaction with kind of the civilian benchmark, it's very uneven, and there's a lot of data to suggest that DoD beneficiaries are not as happy with the quality of their health care as their civilian counterparts. So I think it's an area where you've got to focus first on the question of how do we deliver the best quality outcomes to this population, And then are there ways to do that in a way that's actually more efficient as well?
I'm going to have to ask you a little bit about some of the statements that Donald Trump have made. National security professionals from both sides of the aisle have been critical in terms of some of the statements by the Republican presidential candidate. Understanding that you have served Democratic administrations and are one of the leading Democratic defense and national security minds, how do you, and somebody who is seen as potentially the next senior defense official in the Pentagon, perhaps, depending on how things go on November the 8th, in taking the totality of what Mr. Trump has said, what are the things that concern you the most regarding what he's saying about national security?
I think one of the things that concerns me is that when I look at the unique leadership role that the U.S. has to play in the world, one of our core strategic advantages is our system of alliances, whether it's our allies in Europe, in NATO, whether it's our allies in Asia and elsewhere, that when we commit ourselves to an operation, to solving a problem, we always have allies and partners who come with us and who share that burden, often before we even ask. I mean, remember what happened after 9/11. NATO invoked Article 5 to stand solidly with us, even though we didn't ask. I mean, so I think the underappreciation of the strategic value and power of alliances is a real misreading of our current situation and the history of the last several decades since the end of World War II. So that is the first thing. I think the second is just the oversimplification of the dialogue and the discussion. When we talk about a problem like dealing with ISIS, this is very complicated. In some ways, trying to defeat ISIS is going to be more complicated than dealing with Al-Qaeda core was. So it is.
How so, by the way?
Well, Al-Qaeda in the Fatah in Afghanistan, Pakistan was really focused on stupendous, highly symbolic attacks, like taking down the trade centers and so forth. And so they were very centrally controlled, very disciplined, very complex and highly orchestrated. That meant that there had to be a lot of coordination and communication that would enable us to have opportunities to disrupt and prevent those attacks. A group like ISIL, first of all, by establishing a caliphate in physical form, a territory that they call the caliphate, they have outcompeted all of the other jihadist groups to say, we're the ones that are actually establishing the caliphate here on earth, and they have a huge recruiting advantage to attracting foreign fighters to them. Secondly, by saying we don't really have to do 9/11s or take airplanes out of the sky, although we may try to do that, we're happy if a few guys with some guns and some explosives or suicide vests go do about Brussels or maybe a Paris, or if a lone wolf, who we haven't even talked to, shoots up a nightclub or his workplace in the United States, and he claims, drives a truck on a waterfront and claims that they're inspired by us and sort of invokes our brand. That's great. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. That is a much harder problem for intelligence and law enforcement to disrupt. And the fact is, ISIL is playing across that spectrum. And so we have to have a much more multidimensional strategy that's certainly aimed at taking away their territory, certainly aimed at taking their external attack planners off the battlefield and disrupting their operations, but also more focused on the homeland security dimensions, more focused on disrupting the radicalization process, and more focused on community resilience so that we can try to identify those lone wolves before they ever act. So it's a complicated problem. I am very confident that with the right leadership and resources, we can have a successful strategy against ISIS. But what I've just described bears no resemblance to the way it's talked about, at least on one side of the current campaign.
Do you think that, in terms of the 1,000 flowers blooming, I mean, do national security leaders have to do, without necessarily being critical, but a better job to sort of tell the American people that, look, when every vehicle can become a weapon, and there is self-radicalization or self-association, or even as the fact is going on, sort of, oh yeah, sure, I'm with ISIS, for example. Do Americans have to come to grips with the fact that some of these things are not necessarily as stoppable as everybody would like to believe in a free society?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is it's very difficult to have an absolutely perfect system for preventing every lone wolf attack, and that's where the resilience piece comes in. It's building community structures that sort of recognize that someone may be going down that direction. It's trying to create obstacles to those folks from getting the means of perpetrating such attacks, but it's also building community resilience in the face of some of the things that may happen. But ultimately, I think if we go after ISIS core, we deny them the ability to establish a caliphate, we disrupt their online activities and their narrative, they're going to become, if they're failing, they're not going to be nearly the same kind of magnet that they are today because they've been seen as the new vanguard. So I think you can take a lot of air out of the balloon over time.
I want to ask one sort of side note. Donald Trump has accused the president, but now increasingly, Secretary Clinton for having caused or created ISIS. You were part of the Iraq study group, the bipartisan group that at the worst days of the Iraq War advised on the strategy the United States and its allies needed to be able to turn the tide and eventually manage to extricate ourselves from that and also give Iraq the best chance of succeeding. What did you learn about the origins of ISIS? I mean, what are the origins of ISIS?
The origins of ISIS, as I understand it, really comes out of the core of the Iraqi insurgency. The original insurgency, mostly disaffected Baathists, Sunnis, folks who had been in the armed forces that were not allowed a place in the new Iraqi government, people who felt marginalized because they were Sunnis or they had been members of the Ba'ath Party. That core insurgency that started pretty early on was raging by 2005, 2006. Even when we turned things around with the surge and the counterinsurgency strategy, then there was a core, hardcore element that became AQI. I mean, they were the folks who ended up in Camp Bucca and the various detention centers. They are the people who, once AQI was greatly diminished in Iraq, many of them fled to Syria. When Syria's civil war began, that became very fertile ground. It was like pouring oxygen on the spark, in the flame, and they regenerated. So the origins of ISIS go back to the earliest days of the Iraqi insurgency, and some of the mistakes that were made in the early handling of that. And just to remind people, Secretary Clinton was not even in government at that time. So the notion that somehow she was responsible for its creation it's not true. And I don't even understand, the sort of apparent logic behind that.
Did the Obama administration, one criticism of the administration is that the president moved too slowly in trying to figure out some solution to the Syria crisis. And then that in turn has sparked a migration crisis that allowed the formation of the caliphate, if you will, and ultimately caused a lot of the challenges that we're now seeking to unwind. How do you respond to that? I think from the president's standpoint, it's don't get involved in another Mideast conflict that you don't necessarily have a solution to. But how do you respond to the broader criticism that the administration in the United States could have moved more aggressively, more quickly to try to address this challenge earlier as opposed to doing it now?
Yeah, I appreciate President Obama's assessment that the U.S. did not have vital interests at stake in Syria early on that would have necessitated a large-scale military intervention. But I think what the administration underestimated was the degree to which allowing this, the prolonging of the civil war, the fact that it was allowed to fester and continue, that it would beget a number of challenges to the regional stability that we do have a strong interest in, whether it was creating a safe haven for ISIS in part of the country, whether it was putting huge pressure on states like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq, and then the migrant crisis, which is on a scale that we haven't seen since World War II, the pressures that would put on not only neighboring states but now Europe. So I think I think there was an underappreciation of the strategic impact of a festering civil war in the heart of the Middle East. And so I do think there were some opportunities missed early on to try to create the conditions for a negotiated departure of Assad earlier. But that is, hindsight is always 20/20. I think they were a very difficult set of decisions.
There are those who are looking at the ISIS fight. Admiral Stavridis, former commander of NATO, recently said that look for ISIS to be in Asia. That's a key concern in terms of its sort of global spread. Obviously now ISIS, there's the Syria part of it, the Iraq part of it, now the Libya part of it that's been opened up. Concern that there's an Asia part of it, certainly there's a Europe part of it, and you could even say that there's a U.S. component to that too. How global does the coalition have to be? I mean, is this truly a global coalition similar to what we had against Al-Qaeda right after 9/11? Is that the sort of approach that has to...
I think it does need to be a global coalition, but we need to have regionally focused groupings. So for example, you mentioned Southeast Asia. It is true that ISIS is trying to get a toehold in Indonesia and elsewhere. But we have actually a really good track record dealing with jihadist groups in Southeast Asia, and quite successfully. You think about the counterinsurgency work that was done with the Philippines, for example, and with other partners like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia. I think it's, in this instance, what we want to do on a more proactive basis is lean forward with intelligence and law enforcement cooperation with those regional partners to get ahead of this and prevent ISIS from kind of gaining that toehold. We know how to do this because we've done it before, and I think I'd like to see more proactive emphasis on trying to prevent ISIS from even gaining a toehold where it's trying before it becomes, sort of entrenched in a place like Syria or Libya and so forth.
Stay tuned for the next two segments of our interview with CNAS CEO Michèle Flournoy. Thanks for joining us, and if you have any comments about this show or suggestions for future coverage, please email me at vmuradian@defaeroreport.com. And stay tuned to the Defense and Aerospace Report for the best in national security coverage with interviews with top defense and aerospace leaders worldwide. Follow us on Twitter @DefAeroReport and on Facebook on the Defense and Aerospace Report, and follow me on Twitter @VagoMuradian. Have a great day.